Recently, I did a video on why American conservatives should care about Ukraine. So it's not really a leftist position to support Ukraine against Russia. And I mentioned several reasons for that. For example, the Russian regime is the KGB. They want Alaska back, and they are really, really close to the United States. And also, Russia has its agents and spies everywhere in America. But there's a new development. We've now heard on Russian television that communist North Korea may send 100,000 troops and who knows how many workers into Ukraine. That's right. Now, for a long time, I've been warning about that sort of thing. It's possible that at some point it may be Chinese soldiers, not just North Korean soldiers. So China has already built this giant infrastructure, the new Silk Road, these trade routes, and everything along these trade routes is military grade. So they can move goods, but they also can move soldiers and they can move equipment right to Ukraine, right into Europe. But the moment China actually does that, there will be much graver consequences around the world and certain trade wars, and you may see great chaos in international financial markets. So you can't sell to China anymore. You can't produce anything in China anymore. You know, what's going to happen to manufacturing in the US? Will it come back home? And those sort of questions. So this may happen in the near future, right? But for this to happen, you need another proxy war on top of the Ukrainian thing. So it could be the invasion of Taiwan. It could be North Korea starting an actual war. But it's not going to be North Korea deciding. It's going to be Russia and China deciding on that. So at some point, you may see Chinese communist soldiers. You may see them fighting in Europe, okay? With the blessing of the Russian government, which is really the KGB. And for the time being, it is publicly discussed now that North Korea is going to send its communist troops to Ukraine, starting with around 100,000 soldiers. So this was a guy on Russian television, Igor Korotchenko, and you will find the news stories about that. He's an expert in defense, and he was talking about 100,000 North Korean volunteers who are going to come to Ukraine. Now, of course, this has nothing to do with voluntary. This is kind of a certain option, a military option. And they may start with 100,000 soldiers, but it can be 250,000 soldiers. It could be 350,000 soldiers. And that would tip the scale in Ukraine. So these communist soldiers could then take over the entire Ukraine or most of Ukraine. And in the next step, they could threaten Poland. They could threaten the Baltics, meaning NATO member states. They can also threaten Northern Europe, meaning Finland and Sweden. So at some point, you may see communist Asian troops standing in Sweden and Finland shooting selfies with each other. So how's that for conservative leanings? How is that for a conservative in the United States looking at this? Do you think it's a good idea for communists to take over the entirety of Ukraine under the watchful eye of Sauron, meaning the Kremlin? Do you think this is going to end well? You think this has nothing to do with American interests? What's happening in Europe and what may be happening? Of course, the communists may actually revive the industry in Ukraine, especially the arms industry and various manufacturings of parts and pieces which the Russians need, but also the North Koreans need. So, for example, intercontinental ballistic missiles, or let's say engines for airplanes or other important parts and pieces. So a lot of these parts and pieces were produced in Ukraine up until 2014, 2015, when the Russians went into Crimea, and there was a ban on all future exports. So all of a sudden, very important production was not available anymore for Russia. So if the communists come in, the troops and the workers, be it North Koreans, be it Chinese, they could revive the production and then deliver these services and these goods to the entire Eastern Bloc countries. So Russian production, North Korean production, Chinese production, and these weapons will at some point be used against America or American allies in Asia. So do you still think we should let Russia take Ukraine? That it doesn't matter to American conservatives what happens in Ukraine? Do you still think if you let Russia take Ukraine, then this will make Ukraine Christian conservative and everything will be fine, and then you're saving Ukraine from the woke people or something? And remember, the grandfather of the current dictator of North Korea, the infamous Kim Il-sung, who is hailed as a god in North Korea, that guy was Moscow's puppet. Completely. So the intelligence chief from the Soviets, Beria, personally recommended Kim Il-sung to Stalin. So this was kind of the sales pitch. Oh, we gotta take this guy. We trained him basically in guerrilla warfare, either directly or through our Chinese middleman, whom we also train. This guy is a talent. We need this guy as a puppet leader of North Korea. So it's one catch, he barely speaks any Korean because he spent so much time with the Chinese, but we're going to give him language training and then he can, do these speeches and everything will be fine. And so normally when Russia takes over a country, when they Sovietize a country, it's normally a complete takeover. And we realize this when it was about communist Poland or communist Ukraine. When it was about Eastern Europe. All right, it's a complete takeover. That's what it was. But strangely, in Asia, the impression was created that these new communist countries were somehow independent. So China became independent, supposedly, and the Chinese didn't really like the Russians, and vice versa. And the same thing goes for North Korea. North Korea supposedly became its own thing, even though all these North Korean leaders were trained by the Russians, and there was intelligence infiltration and intelligence control, and the Russians supplied all the necessary weapons. So, you have to consider at least the possibility that Russia really runs North Korea, has been running it until this very day. And so this changes the whole calculation, right? So before the invasion of Ukraine, people thought of the Russian military as fairly weak, and meaning conventional warfare was pretty weak with the Russians. So they still have their nuclear arsenal and they still have some advanced weapon system, but when it comes to troops, tanks, regular Air Force operations, there's a great weakness within Russia. They can barely muster the soldiers they want to use. They tried to invade a country the size of France with only 200,000 troops, and the Air Force was mostly a no-show. And this is not how you do it. Anybody who gets trained in military matters, they will realize you needed at least 500,000, 600,000 troops, and that's even pushing it. And you need massive Air Force operations coordinated with the other branches of the military. So to get air superiority as quickly as possible, so then you can fly around and shoot anything you want. But this didn't happen. So Russians got stuck and they can barely get new soldiers in. But now you get the North Koreans in. 100,000 soldiers, maybe 200, 300, 500,000 soldiers, who knows? Suddenly we realize Russia has Russia has up to 2 million extra soldiers, the North Koreans, which they can use. So Vladimir Putin doesn't even have to order a mass mobilization, which he could do, right? He could give the order, and then you would have a complete control command economy, and such many people would have to be drafted into the military, and after some quick and dirty boot camp, they would be sent to Ukraine to fight. And like this, you could get another 100, 200,000 soldiers, or maybe even more. But this would make Putin extremely unpopular. Nobody wants to really fight the war in Ukraine, so it's a much more elegant solution and a much more stable solution for the Russian regime to use communist troops from North Korea. And we have to ask ourselves, was that the plan to begin with? Was this the calculation of the Russians, that they won't be able to invade all of Ukraine? They would get stuck, and at some point they would have to ship in communist soldiers to decide this thing. Was this the plan to begin with? And are there more pre-planned stages of this global conflict? So, for example, North Korea using its newly developed nuclear missile system to do something dramatic, and then coordinated with the Chinese then take Taiwan. So was this a multi-stage plan to begin with? That's what you have to ask yourselves. How long have the Russians and the Chinese been coordinating? How long have they been coordinating with the North Koreans? So then it becomes a much bigger thing, and that's why you should care as an American conservative. The Russian ambassador in North Korea, Alexander Matsegora, told the Russian news agency TASS, told it about North Korean workers being shipped to Ukraine into these newly acquired territories. They're called independent republics, but we know how this works. Donetsk, Luhansk, and that sort of thing. And this guy tells us that this is all just voluntary, that North Korea decides these things by itself. So this is a matter between North Korea and these newly formed republics in Ukraine. So this is completely independent from whatever the Kremlin does. So if you believe that, then you really don't know much about anything when it comes to these matters. So we've seen Russia rebranding itself, right? So they've rebranded themselves as Christian conservative. It's sort of a hybrid of ideologies, right? So a lot of it is old czarist imperialism, which is not compatible with America, right? An aristocracy that's not compatible with the United States. I mean, didn't the United States win a revolutionary war against the British king, who was closely related to the Russian czars, right? You still remember that? And so, you see the czarist elements in Russia these days, but you still see communism, especially anti-fascism, being celebrated. So this sacrifice of Russian soldiers in the fight against the Nazis, that is being celebrated every single year. And I've talked about this before. For the Russians, the bad guys are usually white folks that are either Central European or Northern European or British and American. So they all look the same to the Russians. Right? The Russians are Slavic, and the Russians have been fighting white guys for a long time, and has become sort of the national fetish in Russia. Alexander Nevsky, centuries ago, fighting off the Teutonic Order that came from what we now call Germany, and the wars with Sweden and some other mini empires, and then of course you had World War II, the Russians fending off the Nazi army, and at a later stage, the main enemy of Russia became the British and the Americans, and the upper class of Britain and America looks fairly German because many of them are actually from Germany. You know, the family history goes back to Germany. So they all look the same to the Russians, and that's why the bad guy is always the white guy. Just so you know that. And so, yeah, what's going to happen if communist troops enter Europe in Ukraine, and then they move towards Poland, they move towards the Baltics, and they move towards Sweden and Finland? What then? Will you care then as American conservatives? And what are the Democrats going to say in the United States when that happens, if that happens? Will the left then claim it's preferable to let Russia get its way, to have these communist troops do what they want to do, to hand these countries to Russia? You know, is that what the American left is going to say then? And what's the American right wing going to say? What are the Republicans going to say? What are the Jordan Petersons out there going to say when Russia actually uses communist troops from Asia? What are they going to say? Are they going to act surprised? They shouldn't be surprised, because this wasn't really hard to guess in the first place. And will they claim that this is just a temporary alliance? Are they going to play that card? It's just, you know, for the short term, you know, Russians getting along with some communists. Is that going to be the excuse? And who's going to believe that excuse? Many, many years ago, I started to pre-select the most interesting books that I can find about the empires, about the intelligence agencies, about insurgencies and counterinsurgencies and revolutions and psychological warfare and biological warfare. I pre-selected the most interesting stuff I can find, and then I read the entire pre-selection. And I've been doing this for roughly 20 years. So I have read about 730 something of the most interesting books out there that I can find. And I figured out that the three superpowers out there, the United States, Russia, and China, they have a really weird relationship with each other. And they would benefit mostly from a secret cartel where they can scare the entire world, don't really destroy each other, but keep any competitors down. So this is something you need to understand. So whenever you listen to a Jordan Peterson type or anybody of that sort, they may tell you it's beneficial for American conservatives to have an alliance with the Christian conservative Russian regime, and this alliance against the Chinese is supposedly needed. But what if there's a much older and deeper deal between Russia and China? What if Russia and China team up against the United States? And what if they all have teamed up a long time ago? To keep everybody scared and to keep everybody down. So there's many ways this Ukraine situation can continue, but whatever happens, you should not be surprised.